guest is J Warner Wallace.
Do the right thing instead of the thing that feels good. To do the right thing instead of the thing that's convenient. If we want people to adopt that kind of difficult truth, we better give them good reason to adopt it.
Share the gospel clear and strong. Stand for, claim your heritage of truth.
Welcome to Heritage of Truth. Today my guest is J Warner Wallace. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, you are a former atheist and cold case detective.
Yes.
And now you are writing books like God's Crime Scene. A cold case detective examines the evidence for a divinely created universe. And these books help people to understand why the biblical worldview makes sense.
Yeah, I think we are definitely at a point in our culture where, and we're seeing it more and more every day, where our values, the things we believe are true, are being challenged. And it's no longer the popular view to be a Christian, or no longer the convenient view, or no longer the view that seems to resonate with public policy or whatever it may be. So I think we have to kind of ask ourselves, how do we deal with our own doubt when we have it, and how do we deal with our beliefs when we're in a crisis situation? And what I was struck with is, if you think about a kind of a biblical response, you see in the Old Testament, you know, when the Israelites are challenged or about to face a huge challenge, God simply tells them, hey, remember what I did for you in Egypt. Remember I parted the Red Sea, that whole thing with the Red Sea? Okay, I did that for you, and it was not just a private experience I gave you. This is something I did publicly in front of everybody. That's your data point. So when you go forward, just remember that data point, that evidential data point, that point of reference. And I think if you look at that, the same thing happens in the New Testament. John the Baptist is starting to have doubts, and he sends his disciples to Jesus. John sent us, and he wants to know, are you the one? You know, okay. Clearly, John's starting to wonder. He's obviously being imprisoned. He's facing sure death. I mean, so he's got his own situation, right? But what does Jesus do? He doesn't tell him, hey, go back and just pray harder about this, or let the Holy Spirit move in you. No, he says, hang on a minute. He does miracles in front of the disciples, and then he says, go back and tell John what you just saw. So over and over again, I think we're asked as Christians to refer back to an evidential data point, a reference point, and remember that going forward. So when times get tough, where else can you go? This is the truth. I've demonstrated it for you evidentially. You know it's true. Where else could you go? Peter says, where else could we go? So I think that's what I'm hoping to do for all of us as a family, is that if we're going to face tough times, you better be able to go back to your evidential reference point. But if I ask Christians, honestly, and I do this all the time in talks around the country, but why are you guys Christians? Very few ever answer with an evidential answer. They'll typically say, well, I was raised in the church, or they'll say I had an experience, and that experience appears to be, but it's a private experience usually. And by the way, every believer of every stripe can say the same thing. What they don't say is, hey, I've examined the evidence for Christianity and the evidence for theism, and I know that the most reasonable inference is that God exists and that Christianity is true. And whether it's a good day or a bad day here in America, I've got to stand firm in this truth because it is what it is. And that's what I think we're trying to do with books like this, is we're trying to say, hey, even on a bad day, the evidence still points in the same direction. And I may not like the fact that this particular defendant, I'm going to bring to trial for a murder. I may even like him. But unfortunately, the evidence points to his guilt. So whether I like him or not that day, he still has to go to trial. And the same thing happens here. If this is true, and it's the most reasonable inference from evidence, then even on a bad day, it's still true. So that's why we write these kinds of books.
Yeah, well, that's great. So what prompted you to examine the evidence for and against creation as if it were a crime scene?
I use a kind of simple technique. I'm always trying to find a way to analogize our discussion. Because look, people have been writing about theism for dozens and dozens of years, and of course before that, hundreds of years. And they've been writing about Christianity for 2,000 years. I mean, it's not as though there's not other books out there that can kind of make a case. But I wanted to take an angle that does two things. Number one, it's crystal clear the moment you get the idea, the concept, how you can examine something. And two, that teaches you a number of principles about how to work cases that then you can apply to any case, including the case for God's existence. So what I'm doing here is giving you a principle and then teaching you a number of skill sets that detectives use so you can apply those skill sets to the evidence. So the principle I'm teaching you here is this simple one. Not every death scene is a crime scene. I get called out to a lot of death scenes, but they're not all murder scenes, because there are 4 ways to die, and 3 of them are not criminal. You can die accidentally, naturally, or by way of suicide. By the way, if that happens, I can play a little game that tells me. I can walk in the room and ask a simple question. Can I explain everything I see in the room by staying inside the room? If I can, it's going to be one of the first three: natural, suicide, or accidental. For an example, let's say I had a victim who's got a gunshot wound, and there's a gun in the room, but there's no sign of forced entry. Everything's locked up from the inside. There's no evidence inside the room of anyone other than the victim. Only fingerprints in the room. The only DNA in the room that belongs to the victim. It's the victim's gun registered to him. It's a single gunshot wound. What do I have? I've got a suicide, because I don't care what it looks like. There's no evidence in the room I can't explain by simply staying in the room.
Right.
Now, on the other hand, if I get in that room and I discover that's not his gun, and there's footsteps, there's footprints, bloody footprints, and they don't belong to him, and the door's open, and I've got to now go outside the room to explain some of this stuff. Well, now I know I've got to shift gears, because if I have to go outside the room to explain what's inside the room, I've got an intruder.
Okay.
So this is the simple principle in investigating death scenes. So I thought to myself, well, could we look at the entire universe and ask the question, can I explain everything I see in the room by staying in the room? If I can, naturalism will explain it. If I have to go outside the room, though, to get something that's inside the room, I've got an intruder. And what would this thing be? So that's what we're doing in God's crime scene. We're simply looking at, yes, it has to be greater than the universe, and it cannot be by definition something that's natural, because all that's natural is space, time, and matter, and the laws that govern such things. So I think what the idea here is to say, well, the best and most reasonable explanation for 8 key pieces of evidence in the room happens to be something that's outside the room. And that's why we call this God's crime scene. Although we don't mean to say that God's culpable of a crime, or even that really he's an intruder, because in reality, of course, if you're the owner, you can't be an intruder. And of course, he's the owner. But the point is, this process of looking at the universe as a crime scene, I think has some value in how we even communicate this to others by staying inside or outside the room.
It kind of indicates that he has left evidence.
Yes, inside the room.
To let us know.
Outside the room.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And Romans 1 talks about that.
That's right. That's right. So a lot of this is biblical, but I wanted to kind of take an approach. So for me, my personal journey was basically this. I was an atheist until I was 35. I had no interest in Jesus or God. But my wife was somebody who thought, it wouldn't be nice to kind of raise our kids in an environment and kind of a culture that she had been raised as kind of a cultural Catholic. And so I thought, okay, I'm willing to go to church with you as an atheist. Because my dad had done that his entire life. So I'm more than happy to go to church with you as an atheist. But I'm not going to go as a believer. So I avoided church as much as I could. And I was maybe 3 years in this new neighborhood. We hadn't gone to church yet. So I thought I was pretty successful. And he decided to go to church on a Sunday. She wanted to go. So I said, well, I'll go wherever you want to go. We went to a big church in which the pastor pitched Jesus. He obviously knew that Jesus was God. But this particular day, he pitched Jesus as a smart, ancient sage, the source of really time-tested, vetted wisdom. And if you would simply read the words of Jesus, you would find that he's very wise. And a lot of what he says will resonate as true for you. So I thought, well, let me see if that's true. So I bought a Bible, and I kind of tried to mine the words of Jesus out of the Bible. But of course, they're embedded in the Gospels. And that caused me to look at the Gospels, and I recognized certain key features in the Gospels that clearly to me looked like eyewitness kind of attributes. So I decided to test the Gospels as eyewitness accounts. That's the first book, Cold Case Christianity, is really how I tested the Gospels. But right away when I decided that the Gospels seemed to me to be reliable eyewitness accounts of this guy named Jesus, if that's the case, what do you do with the resurrection? What do you do with all the miracles of Jesus? And I thought, okay, I'm going to have my philosophically natural worldview tested. Because if these are reliable, do I buy all that stuff? So the next thing I did was take a look at the case for supernaturalism. So what caused me to look at God's existence was really the reliability of the Scripture. I felt these were reliable accounts, but I would reject the supernatural side. So I needed to take a really hard look at my philosophical naturalism to see, is it possible to describe and account for all the evidence by staying in the room? Because if it is, then this can't really be. But if I have to go out of the room anyway to describe those 8 things, then why can't I believe Christianity is true? So this was the second step in my process, and that's why I wrote this book second.
And you have another one coming out.
Yeah, so I just got ready to do the third book. And so the third book will be a case for case making. So in other words, the first book makes a case for Christianity. This makes a case for theism. The third book will be a case for why should you make a case at all?
Which is almost backwards.
Yeah, it seems that way, but I wanted people to have the data first. So when I said I want you to raise the bar on your sense of what faith is, so that you have an evidential faith instead of an accidental faith. If I want you to have that kind of evidential faith, I felt like I needed to give you the evidence first. Now I can call you to have this as part of your life, but I'm going to do that in the third book. So the idea would be to develop a trilogy that will help people take a step in a different direction when it comes to their Christian worldview.
Great. So how did you choose the topics and the arguments to cover in the chapters of this book?
Well, I originally looked at like 10 or 12 different pieces of evidence that I think all of us experience in the room, that we kind of recognize are there. We have to account for it. I knew that some of these were more popular with me as an atheist, so a lot of these were just the things that I thought were really interesting that I wanted to know about as an atheist. So that's part of why I chose those particular 8. We just narrowed it down to 8. Some of them were kind of overlapping, so I was able to kind of condense them into one piece of evidence. So that's kind of how. So we ended up with 8 that I think are important to describe. What I think is interesting about it, let's say I'm investigating you as a suspect in a case. And I've got 2 witnesses who said you did it. Okay, good, I've got eyewitness testimony. I also have your fingerprints and DNA at the scene. Oh, good, I've got forensic material evidence or biological evidence. I also have some interesting behaviors that you did before and after the murder. I've got some behavioral evidence, right? I've also got some statements you make that don't make any sense, so I've got some logic or forensic statement issues. I've got 4 different kinds of evidence, all that point to you as my suspect. That case is actually pretty good. It's a lot better than just eyewitnesses alone.
Right.
So the more different kinds of evidence I have that point to you as the suspect, the better the inference is that you are the suspect. So what I did here is I looked at 4 broad categories of evidence, 2 in each category. 2 cosmological, the fact that we're in a universe that has a beginning and it appears to be fine-tuned for life. 2 biological, the fact that life originates from nothing in the universe and that we have the appearance of fine-tuning in biological organisms. 2 that are mental, the consciousness and free agency. 2 that are moral, the existence of transcendent moral objective truths and the presence and kind of enduring presence of, like it or not, of evil and injustice in the universe. So I've got 4 broad categories and 8 specific pieces. And if these all are best explained by something outside the room, then I think the kind of diverse nature of the cumulative case is actually stronger. And that's why I think that the case is really very strong, because those are the things that really cannot be explained by staying inside the room. What's interesting is our explanation goes outside the room for a source that satisfies all the conditions. But when atheists try to stay inside the room, they end up with 4 or 5 divergent, opposite competing theories for each piece of evidence. So they're saying, well, it could be any one of these 20, 30, 40 different explanations, none of which agree with each other.
Yeah, and some of them are really wild.
And trying to explain each piece, and by the way, whatever you're using to explain this piece won't get you this piece. Our one explanation gets you all 8 pieces. So that's why I think that our explanation is the best.
Do you think that your findings are potentially strong enough to draw someone towards faith?
Well, here's the problem. I mentioned this in the first book, Cold Case Christianity. I think there are 3 reasons why anyone shuns a truth claim. I use the word shun because I can make a little play on words. The first one is rational. You shun the truth because you have rational doubts. I just don't think there's enough evidence for this. I'm open to it. I even want it to be true, but there's not enough evidence. Okay, that's one kind of doubt. But the second kind of doubt is emotional. And you know what? My parents were Christians, and they're jerks, and they were hypocrites, and I can't be. Well, that's not a rational response. That's not because there's an evidential issue.
Right. You
just don't like it, or don't like what you saw. That's emotional. I get that. The third kind is volitional. Jim, I don't care. I'm not interested in that. I'm living my own life. My life is good. Don't bug me. It's a matter of will. I willfully reject something. So to say that any piece of rational argument could satisfy all 3 different kinds of objections probably won't get it done. And so what we have to do is ask questions. One of the questions that a friend of mine, Frank Turek, always asks, and I ask too, is if this was true, would you believe it?
Yeah,
and that's a question that sometimes people will say, no. Well, really? If it's true, you wouldn't believe it? So, I mean, this is something you have to really, and people are honest. Some people won't believe it even if it was true, because they don't want it to be true. So I'm not saying that everyone's like that, but there are people who are like that. So that's why I don't know that, I think, here's the most important thing, though. Young people who we have in our families, between 15 and actually probably 12 and, say, 30, those are the years in which you start to form your kind of worldview ideas, your big worldview ideas, and when, for the most part, they're going to move out of our comfort zone as protective parents into an environment that we're not going to control, either the workplace or the college environment. Mm-hmm. And once they get there, if they don't have strong reasons to believe this is true, and if they haven't already examined all the alternatives to know why they're not true, then get ready.
Oh, yeah.
They're not. So I simply want to show them in this book, here's how we account for these 8 pieces. But I also take the time, and what I did was I wrote the book in 2 sections. There's a back section that goes through every piece of alternative explanation.
Oh, that's
so
good.
If you've got, we think that consciousness is due to a creative mind, which is the source of all living beings, and who has created in his image. So don't be surprised you have a mind. But if you want to know how they account for mind, I'll cover every single alternative and show you why those don't work. So the idea here was that you wouldn't just have what our argument is, that you'd have a decent starting point. Mm-hmm. And of course you could write, I read 130 some odd books in order to write this one book. So this would be a very big volume if I try to include everything. But I've given you pointers. So not only will I show you what their view is, I'll point you to their work. So you can go out and read their work for yourself. But I want my young people, under my leadership, to see all the alternatives as well as just my view.
Absolutely.
And I don't want them to see those alternatives for the first time out there. I want to see them for the first time while I'm with them.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think that hopefully this is a resource that'll be a gateway resource to other resources that'll kind of get the conversation started. Most of us as parents have really not thought clearly about why we believe mind or free agency, or these are the issues of origin of life. How much does anybody really know about the studies that are being done on origin of life? You need a gateway book. You need something that gets the conversation started, from which you can do deeper work if you want to. But at least you can answer those questions for your kids.
Yeah, and it's so important. I was one of those kids that went off to college, and I had never heard those other ideas. And I had these atheist professors who were teaching all the stuff that I had never heard before.
That's right.
And with authority, and I was believing them.
That's right. I don't want anyone just to believe me on my authority either. I'm going to make the case. I'm going to show you the strengths and weaknesses. I also try to cover the objections that the insiders have for the outside explanation.
Yeah.
Because they have some objections to our outside explanation. We're going to cover those too. So I try to do it with enough clarity that you can kind of at least assess the evidence fairly. Do I have an opinion on how the evidence? Well, of course. Every prosecutor has an opinion. Every detective has an opinion.
Right.
And so does every defense attorney. So there's no one in the room without an opinion. The question is, are we still able to hold our opinions with our open hand? So that in case we're wrong, we're willing to surrender them. We're willing to change them. And so that's what we hope that this book can do.
Are you still working in?
I consult with the DA's office, but if I'm honest with you, if you ask my partners in the DA's office, they'd say, you're never here. So I try to get there as much as I can, but this work is becoming more and more consuming of my time. Also, I get asked to do television and other areas where they want someone to consult on cold. So I am doing consulting, but not necessarily I have one case that I am actively helping with, but for the most part, I'm just kind of reviewing cases and generally helping where I can. Because in the end, I had to make a decision. I did a number of these cases. I worked for 25 years in that profession. And I just say, that's important work. It really is.
Yeah.
But I was a second-generation law enforcement officer. My dad did the same work before me. Well, now my son does the same work. So at some point, it's important to kind of pass the baton to the next generation of Jim Wallace's, he all have the same name, who will do the same work. And one thing I've learned is that my dad was good enough to get out of my way when it was my turn. So I needed to get out of my son's way when it says.
So are you teaching this anywhere? I mean,
yeah,
you obviously speak.
I teach at Biola. I think we have the best apologetics graduate program in the land. I hate to say that because there's a lot of good ones. But I love that program. And I felt very lucky to have the opportunity to be able to teach there. So I do teach as an adjunct there. And so we're teaching basically our principles of investigation. And I still do some stuff at my department where I'm helping citizen academies kind of see what we do as an agency. So I get a chance to do some of that. But for the most part, my time is consumed with making this case for Christians. Here's the thing that gets me. When you ask Christians why they're Christians, the answers they give. My family is divided between atheists and Mormons. My dad remarried and his second wife's Mormon, and his kids of the second marriage, 6, are all raised Mormon. And I just think that our answers need to be robust and different enough to stand out amongst all the other theistic worldviews. And every theistic worldview could say something like, Well, I was raised as a Muslim, or a Buddhist, or a Mormon. Or I've had an experience that tells me that Islam is true, or that Buddhism is true, or that Mormonism is true. Or I'm different now than I was before I adopted this view. Everyone can say that. Those are the three categories of answers I usually get from Christians.
Yeah.
Our answers should be different. We're the one group that can actually say, this is rooted in history, and I was able to study the history and study the philosophy and the science, and it turns out that all of these things converge on one truth. This is all true.
Yeah.
And I can make a case for it. If you ask me for the 5 reasons why the Bible is reliable, I can give you those. The 5 reasons why I think God exists, I can give you those. I can actually make a case for why I believe this is true. That's what our answer ought to sound like. But I think that if we were to ask Christians across the spectrum, could they make that kind of defense for what they believe to a world that clearly wants to hear it put that way?
Yeah.
Could they ever do it? No. So now is the time for us to rethink. As we're seeing the culture shift, do I think we can win it? I don't even care if we can win it. God will take care of what God will take care of. But I do want to be faithful in the crisis. Do I think we can be faithful in the crisis if we're not even sure if it's evidentially true? It's going to be a lot harder.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think that God expects us to do that. I don't think that God says, hey, I'm going to give you no evidence of this. I'm not going to give you anything to support what I'm saying. And true faith will be you just kind of holding on in spite of the lack of evidence. That's not a biblical view of faith. Over and over again, Jesus says, I showed you this. 40 days I'll spend with you after the resurrection, giving you many more convincing proofs. The commitment to serving our doubt, to answering our doubt, is so high in Scripture that I think we need to take that view of faith moving forward as a culture. And I think the Christianity would be a very different place. We'd be in a very different place if we could make this kind of sustained argument. By the way, when a hot topic cultural issue that's unpopular is adopted by our culture, that is not Christian in terms of its moral perspective, in terms of whatever it may be, that's when I think we need to be able to know, okay, that's not right, it's not true, and here's the 5 reasons why I know it's not true. Here's the 5 reasons why I would never ground my moral decisions in that worldview. That's why we have to have those answers, especially young people.
Oh, yeah.
I always say there's a mathematics in the university that's not good for us. Here it is. Uninformed, ill-equipped young people. Church is not doing a great job equipping them to sustain that argument. Add to that a hostile university setting with 4 or 5 times more likely to be atheists than the general population.
Oh, yeah.
Faculty. And the third dimension is these are fallen young people who want to chase their passion, like all of us, right? So if you can give me an alternative view as 20 years old that'll account for how I got here and how life changes and how to solve problems, but it also allows me to sleep with my girlfriend tonight without feeling bad about it, goodbye Christianity. So this is the tail that wags the dog anyway, is that they have this desire for it not to be true, so they can chase the stuff they want to chase with impunity.
Right.
So we have to make sure that this is an inconvenient truth, Christianity, because it's going to cause us to resist our temptations, to delay gratification, to do the right thing instead of the thing that feels good, to do the right thing instead of the thing that's convenient. If we want people to adopt that kind of difficult truth, we better give them good reason to adopt it. And that's what I think is lacking right now. So that's why we write books like this.
I think definitely we need to be well versed in apologetics, supporting what we believe and why we believe it. But you mentioned that I've changed thing. There is also the factor of that God makes us a new creation when we are saved.
Yes. So here's how I balance all that.
Okay.
I think you're absolutely right. I would never suggest that my work in investigating the gospel was the primary foundation of my changed life.
Right.
Instead, what happened was for 35 years, you couldn't even approach me on this issue.
Yeah.
I would have shouted you down.
Even
and
if you've seen someone change.
Oh, it didn't matter.
Yeah,
So what happened was that God did something first in me to remove my hostility to even hearing the case.
Right.
But then it was the case. So the same thing happens all the time, right?
Oh, yeah.
Is that God does something first to call, but then Jesus still demonstrated something for these people. It wasn't just that.
For me, it was creation.
Right.
When I was convinced of creation.
Right. Then that's so everything's. So again, it was some piece of evidence that convinced you, but you didn't get there on your own.
No.
God called you first,
That's
opened
right.
your heart to even the possibility.
Right.
Then the case was available to you. I would never have even considered this case. That's right. Now that's a difficult truth, I think, for a lot of non-believers, because they don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
But my own personal experience kind of tells me, because if you'd have asked me, I thought I was losing my mind. Because when I first was open to the idea of even studying this, and I was open to going out and buying a Bible, that's not me. And I thought, well, am I just losing it? I mean, if you'd known me a month before I bought that Bible, you'd have said, Jim is never going to buy a Bible. and here I was, interested enough to begin this process.
Wow.
So what made that change occur? And I can tell you, it wasn't any felt need on my part. It wasn't, I've got a problem I got to solve. It wasn't, I'm hoping for heaven, I'm afraid of hell. It wasn't any of those things. Mm-hmm. It just was that God had done something to remove my hostility toward him enough to allow me to look at the evidence.
Yeah,
so I think you're right. That's the thing that precedes everything else.
Yeah.
But it doesn't remove our responsibility to make a case. I think we have a role to play. We're the means by which God accomplishes that end.
No, I am a firm believer in apologetics.
Right. But not everyone who's in the church, though, would have a similar opinion. Yeah. People say, hey, no, God does this, it's all God. You don't need to... Really? Well, that doesn't seem like an example we see in Scripture. Mm-hmm. The book of Acts is filled with people who were chosen on the basis of their eyewitness status. That upper room was filled with people who had to have seen Jesus from the baptism to the resurrection. Mm-hmm. They're not going to replace Judas with anybody else. Why? Because we need direct evidence to be used to convince this culture. Mm-hmm. We're going to use all of your eyewitness testimony, which is direct evidence, to convince a culture. Why couldn't God just snap his fingers and make it happen? Why would God have to use us at all? Why have to use the apostles at all? Yeah. Because God does something, but we have a role to play.
Yeah, we do. We do. And that's why I was really interested in hearing from you about this book. And you've also been on Frank Turek's show, and if people watch the NRB, it might be repeated again.
Yes, well, I have a show on NRB called Cold Case Christianity.
You do?
And now it's once a week, 28-minute show where we go through some issue that's either in God's crime scene or in Cold Case Christianity. And it's just called Cold Case Christianity. But with Frank, we have partnered, and I'll just give you kind of a selfless plug for Frank. He's got an organization called crossexamined.org, and we just started, Frank and I, and a gentleman named Mike Adams, who's really hilarious, a great thinker out of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. We do a thing called Cross-Examine College Prep, where what we do is we travel from church to church, and we do a 7-hour seminar that prepares young people for college. Good. So we'll make the case in a variety of categories, provide written material that students can take with them, that help them to stand firm in 3 distinct areas. The case for theism, the case for Christianity, and how to survive in college. Yeah. Those 3 topics we're really good to talk about, and that's called Cross-Examine College Prep. So, in a selfless plug, if anyone is interested in having us come to your church, we really are there to kind of teach the cases in a way that young people and their parents can grab. So when they spend the next 4 years in university, they'll at least know the foundation has been built.
Oh, that's so important. Because they say up to 70% of the students who enter college don't go back to their faith.
And here's what I'm seeing in that Pew report. These folks are not yet atheists. Because while Christianity has dropped by 8% in the last year, atheism has only risen by 1.3, I think. So it's not like all this 8% went over here. They all slipped into a category called the Nuns. They just claimed no religious affiliation. Here's what's interesting, though. If you ask them, are you an atheist yet? They don't, no, not an atheist. I'm over here, I just have a religious affiliation. What that really means is these are theists and deists who no longer think Christianity is true, or don't want to identify with it at least.
Right.
But they aren't claiming to be agnostic or atheist yet. So we have an opportunity to reach the nuns, the people who say, what religious affiliation? None.
And
we need to reach them.
In college, they want to be able to use their mind. They don't want to just say, well, because I believe.
That's right. No, absolutely. I mean, that's the same thing. I could never understand how the cops I knew could be so unevidential about their religious beliefs. They're so evidential about everything else, but if it comes to your religious beliefs, you can't give me 5 good reasons why it's true. That just, to me, seemed like you were just turning your brain off in order to believe that thing.
Yeah.
If just 1 or 2 of them had been able to say, well, no, I can give you 5 reasons right now, I always wonder what would that have done? What kind of stone would that have put in my shoe at an earlier age? But one after the other, I could usually out-circle them, out-think them, out-speak them, I could shout them down by just making what little I did know was far more than what little they knew.
Wow.
So we need to know enough to be able to hold us firm, because the other side's going to know something too.
Right. Well, the other thing is Jesus was not an example of somebody who just said, just believe what I say. And,
that's right.
I mean, he gave evidence through the miracles, and he also was very, very intelligent.
Right, think
and
about
he gave such wisdom.
Absolutely, but he always would come in and he would heal, and then he would herald. That order is important.
Yeah.
He would heal all these people in town, and then he would say some recorded message we have now in Scripture. Well, why do you do it in that order? You do it in that order because I'm going to demonstrate for you the authority upon which I'm now about to speak to you. So let me demonstrate why you should listen. And now that I got your attention, here we go.
Okay.
So I think in the end, if you want our young people to hear the message of Jesus, you better establish the authority of Jesus first, so that message is clear. Or if you want to hear the message of Scripture, you better establish the reliability of Scripture first, and then we'll make the message clear.
Well, that's great. I wish we had more time because
I
I'm
appreciate you
really
having me.
enjoying this. But where can people find you online?
At coldcasechristianity.com, even with the new book, everything will be under that banner. I write there 3 times a week. I post a video once a week. The NRB broadcast is posted there.
Okay.
A podcast once a week. So there's always
Well,
a
you're
resource
busy.
there.
And teaching college,
I have
too?
to. Well, this is why, like last week, I only got 2 blog posts because I was traveling to get here. So I do my best to try to do 3 blog posts, 1 video, and 1 podcast a week.
Okay. Well,
At
thank
Cold
you
Case
so
Christianity.
much, everybody. This is God's Crime Scene.
Yep, that's
and
right.
also Cold Case Christianity by
I appreciate
J Warner
it.
Wallace.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Share